It's not the actual allergens themselves, it's just somehow we've become less or more penetrable and more susceptible to these allergens. And the mechanism, we'll go back to the statement we started with, is probably gut-based.
I want to take advantage of the fact I don't think we've ever had a gastroenterologist on the show before. And so a common trope that you hear in health and wellness is that all disease begins in the gut. All disease begins in the gut. There's no better expert than you to validate whether or not that's there's validity to that statement. So is it true? Does all disease begin in the gut?
Great question. And that's actually a Hippocratic quote. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, what morphed to be modern medicine anyway. He said all diseases begin in the gut. I think it's only many thousands of years after he said it that we're beginning to kind of understand the actual genius behind that concept. The gut, I've come to understand it as the interface between the environment and the actual human being. It's where Earth meets human, basically. And it's a very interesting ecosystem within it. It's not a simple organ system, from mouth to the end of the gut. We could say it's a 6 meter long canal or tube. But what is becoming quite evident is it is also the site of symbiosis, where we've got these enormous bacterial, viral, and fungal populations that coexist with us. And so it seems if you look at it from a zoomed out perspective, that modern disease, which I like to say is diseases of inflammation or diseases of modernity, it seems to be due to a alteration in this gut microbiome. And that seems to be the mechanism that all diseases begin in the gut. And at the heart of that statement, what is disease? We've got to look at that as well. And I'd say at the heart of that is the fact that most disease is just chronic inflammation. That's what's driving it.
Wow. So what's the relationship then between the gut, which begins at the mouth, ends at the anus, right?
Yeah.
What is the relationship between the gut and inflammation?
Okay. Very, very good question. The answer is not so straightforward. Take a 70 kilogram man, right? And he's got a few trillion cells. That same man is made up of many trillions more bacteria as well. So we're actually more bacteria and fungi than we are human in terms of the amount of the genome carried and the cells carried as well. When there is a disruption to this gut bacterial system, this ecosystem, the city basically, and most of these bacterial species are found in the colon, which is the organ of my expertise, we seem to set off a chain of events, a very, very very vicious cycle of events, which seems to compromise the gut integrity. Now, people say, well, do you see gut inflammation when you do colonoscopies? And I say, yeah, absolutely. If people have overt inflammatory diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, these are all very well-known conditions, autoimmune conditions of the gut. We can see it. We can see bleeding, we can see ulceration, inflammation. However, most people don't have that, yet they have inflammation. How does that work? And that leads us to a concept we call intestinal permeability, or in the internet, colloquially kind of knows it as leaky gut, right? And you hear about a lot of gut health or leaky gut protocols. But intestinal permeability is the more scientific term for it. And this permeability is not something that we can overtly see, right? It's not visible to the naked eye or through a colonoscope. It is actually a microscopic process, a process where the viability between the cells, the tight junctions between the cells, are somewhat loosened. So that leaves us open to an environmental attack or environmental triggers that seem to cross this very, very sensitive gut to blood barrier and allows this systemic inflammatory process to take place. So in summary, the actual mechanism is leaky gut. Leaky gut is the driver of many of these inflammatory diseases.
Wow. So you can't necessarily, when you're going in there during, say, routine colonoscopy, you can't necessarily see the leakiness per se.
Yeah.
but you can see other signs that are associated with that, I suppose.
Absolutely. So, I mean, just to give you an example, we talk of skin diseases, right? Eczema, psoriasis, rosacea, acne, and most of the treatments that modern medicine will give you is actually external. We put creams and apply light and so forth to treat these diseases, but the mechanism is probably initiated in the gut. Wow. And this process we cannot see. It is an invisible, non-tangible process. I mean, there are some tests that have been developed, things like fecal zonulin testing and various others, but they're not standardized. They're not accurate. But most people within the Western world or developed nations will suffer an element of leaky gut. And that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, you can get into more philosophical debates as to whether that is the trade-off for living in civilization, right? Maybe that's a trade-off that we've got to deal with. But I suspect it doesn't need to be. I think there are ways that we can combat it, but it requires a very broad zoomed out perspective to understand what is actually going on.
Wow. So in the context of the modern world, what would you say are the more common instigators of undue intestinal permeability?
Okay, right. This is a commonly asked question, and the answer is not so straightforward. There is something like 4 to 5 preservatives in most food types, right? We've got all forms of preservatives, and they seem to be increasing by the year. We've got emulsifiers, we've got various additives, we've got a method of farming, which has been my interest actually, farming, something that I've really tried to understand. Method of farming which promotes agrochemical use in the quest for yield, for higher yields and higher profitability. So we are fundamentally under attack at every angle from the foods that we consume. And as we move further away from this whole food-based method of eating, where obviously the preservative and preservative additive loads are less, to a more ultra-processed way of eating, we are simply exposing the gut to these additives. The arguments made about macros in terms of the obesity / inflammatory metabolic pathway. I think the real truth is actually far more complex than that.
Wow. Yeah, people constantly are battling online about what they believe we should or shouldn't be eating. But I feel like as an expert in the human GI tract, you must have a very unique, dare I say, even authoritative vantage point on what it is that humans are meant to consume. Yeah,
I mean, I believe from an evolutionary standpoint, we're a very, very flexible species of primate, right? We were clearly hunter-gatherers for huge proportion of our history as human beings. And then something critical occurred 10 to 15,000 years ago, where agriculture starts becoming popular in the Fertile Crescent, in what is now modern-day Iran. And for its obvious advantages, agriculture just exploded globally, because it allowed the production of steady-state calories, allowed us to settle in cities or villages, which then grew into cities. We stopped being hunter-gatherers, and that was hugely advantageous for us as human beings. The trade-off being that we went from situations where we were moving and leaving our waste behind to having to coexist with our waste. So infectious diseases rose very, very rapidly. But to answer your question, we went from being very dependent on animal protein and fat with seasonal foods and maybe very small quantity of grain, to being highly dependent on grain and starch-based calories. And we had adaptations within that 10 to 15,000 year period, which allowed us to break these foods down. Our amylase, which is the enzyme that breaks down our starches, increased manyfold. And,
Wow.
The ability to ingest dairy started in this period. We weren't consuming much in the way of dairy prior to this 15,000 year period. You drink mother's milk, but then after a certain age, the baby stopped consuming milk, and that was it for dairy, or milk, I should say. But we adapted very, very rapidly in that time frame. It's really interesting, even talking about amylase, the domestic dog, or the dogs, the wolves that we domesticated, 60,000 years ago, which then became the dog, which was very advantageous for us in terms of protection and hunting and so forth, developed the same mutations as we did because they were coexisting and eating with us. So dogs can break down amylase or starch and will consume starch. They've even got the taste receptors for fructose to taste fruit. Wolves don't. So it shows us about that coevolution of man and dog in this ebbs and flows of diet.
It's wild. Have you ever seen that meme? It's like a wolf looking upon a campfire, and the wolf, like, there's a thought bubble above the wolf's head. And it's like, maybe I can go over there and make friends with these humans for some food. What's the worst that can happen? Yeah. And then the next frame over is like a pug with its face smushed, 100,000 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's an elegant analogy though, right? Wolves, their numbers in the wild are certainly very low compared to the domestic dog, which would number billions, They became extremely successful. If you measure a species success by numbers, humans and dogs became very successful. But in the quest for that population growth, there appears to be a compromise in health, right? The cranial structure of a dog, the cranial structure of a human being, the stature of a dog versus the stature of a wolf. It's the same with us. We shrunk with agriculture. We became shorter. The teeth got crowded. Our breathing was compromised. But hey, life got simpler, and we were able to pursue other things. We developed poetry and philosophy and art and organized religion, mathematics, legal code. All of that came through agriculture. So that appears to be the trade-off for this world that we're existing now.
Fascinating. So true. Wow. From the vantage, so you've probably scoped many, many, many people over the course of your career. Can you tell what their diet is primarily composed of through the lens of the colon?
Yeah, it's interesting. People come and see me with a gastrointestinal complaint, right, in consultation. I sit down and I talk to them. A lot of people, increasingly so, actually talk of symptoms like gastro-oesophageal reflux or GORD. Huge proportion of people suffer abdominal bloating and gas and flatulence and belching and distress from that, cramping, diarrhea, constipation, just a huge spectrum of symptoms. I could go in there and do the colonoscopy and endoscopy and do biopsies, and everything could be reported as normal, right? I would then see that patient in rooms to follow up on their scope, and I'd say, listen, there is no obvious inflammatory diseases. There's no cancer. Your biopsies are normal. See you later. I mean, and that was a horrible way for me to practice medicine. And over time, over a decade plus of practicing gastroenterology, that just systematically wore me down. I was starting to lose my love for the job because I didn't feel like I was providing a service for these people that saw me, and hence my descent into the abyss, as I call it, trying to understand what was driving all these distress. These gut symptoms. And what I've discovered is embedded within our gut, within this enteric nervous system, or the ENS as we call it, is this beautiful primordial consciousness that's actually telling people that, hey, something's not right with what you're doing. The external environment is wrong. People get this consciousness activated within them. They come and see me, but if I'm not pointing out what is actually going on with the environment, I haven't done them a service. To label them with something like IBS or something like that and see you later, go do a low FODMAP diet, it's not ideal. So a lot of my consultation focuses on explaining the environment that is broken around them to explain the basis of these diseases. For instance, abdominal bloating is probably a sign of a declining gut microbiome. right? So a lot of people with abdominal bloating are triggered by fibres and fermentable carbohydrates, stuff that you'd find in oats and lentils and beans and so forth, foods that we would have tolerated very well 50 to 60 years ago. But less and less people tolerate these healthy foods. And the reason for that is not that the foods themselves are problematic. It is reflective of a declining gut microbiome that is no longer able to deal with these starches, no longer able to deal with these soluble and insoluble fibers. So whilst it's okay to say, well, I'll avoid all these foods now and focus on foods that don't trigger it, I don't think we're fixing the underlying problem, which is the actual declining gut microbiome themselves.
Wow, so interesting. Yeah, it's so true. People have so many sensitivities today.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we're the most adaptable species on the planet.
Yeah.
So why is it the case that so many people seem to be struggling so much? I mean, I don't know how much time you spend on TikTok, but like hot girls have IBS or all girls have IBS is like a trending meme on TikTok, which is, I'm just bringing it up to illustrate the fact that this is just has become so commonplace as to become the norm that people are just struggling with all kinds of the entire constellation of GI symptoms.
I think it's absolute apathy from our species should we normalize pathology, right? And that is happening more and more. And, and the medical system, my system hasn't helped with that. I think that there's been this system of kind of gaslighting symptoms and saying, well, that's just kind of how you're made. We should never normalize it. But to understand it, Max, you really have to expand your mind. And this is why I'm so focused on awareness and consciousness. We really have to expand consciousness to be able to take in all this information. And people don't want to believe that, right? They believe that living in this concrete jungle that we've built ourselves is somehow synonymous with success. But really, it can be. But you have to also recognize the factors that might be bringing us down, to understand that there is pesticides and agrochemicals within our food systems, that we have to understand that the soil health is declining, and the soil is this enormous bank of microbiomes, which is where we actually get our gut microbiome from. So we need to understand these concepts, understand farming. We have to understand the corporate takeover of food. We have to understand the corporate takeover of farming. And people are not ready for that discussion. Well, some are for sure, but this is a complex, in-depth discussion that people choose to ignore. It's too hard.
Yeah, our lagging awareness of these sorts of issues is really tragic. I mean, we had an expert on the show we were talking about before we started rolling who made a very clear connection between these agrochemicals and Parkinson's disease, a condition that has so many neurologists and medical practitioners in general just scratching their heads regarding the etiology, right? The pathophysiology of that condition. But what if it's right there in front of our noses? It's been there the entire time, And so I'm just so grateful for people like you bringing awareness to just how mutated and toxic the food supply has become.
Absolutely. Just on that point with regards to Parkinson's, I spoke recently at a farming conference, and the farming community is aware of how sick their farmers are getting and the community surrounding farms.
Wow.
Farms have become this toxic bowl of agrochemicals, and the people that are helping us produce these foods, these farmers, and they're tied in with these agricultural companies to farm a certain way, right? You have to use their chemicals, you have to use their seeds, and we can talk in depth about that later. But the farmers are getting sick. As we speak in Australia, in the state of Victoria, there is a case where farmers are taking Monsanto or Bayer to court over 800 cases of Hodgkin's lymphoma, right? Where they're saying, look, we have developed this hematological malignancy, this hematological cancer, blood cancer, as a result of this. So there's a class action court case going on at the moment, and the outcome will be very, very interesting. But there is zero doubt about it. These farmers that are farming with this new corporate way of farming, they're getting sick, and the communities around them are getting very sick as well. So whereas historically we see rural communities used to be the healthiest because they were immersed in nature, they're not. That's not the case. Whereas comparatively, you look at populations like the Amish, for instance, where they're still farming the old school way, extremely healthy, very, very low rates of allergy. I mean, there's an elegant study published in the New England Journal of Medicine some years ago, which showed even though they're exposed to 700% more allergens, right, than standard people in cities and so forth, they had far less allergic diseases or diseases of sensitization, which just goes to show it's not the actual allergens themselves. It's just somehow we've become less or more penetrable and more susceptible to these allergens. And the mechanism, we'll go back to the statement we started with, is probably gut based. It's this barrier that is broken down, basically.
Well, I mean, from your vantage point, like, I'm sure you've noticed when you raise concerns today, at least on social media, you get pushback even from people who are as credentialed as you are. Like, you get pushback from medical doctors and PhDs in food science and nutrition that these concerns are all overblown, overhyped fear-mongering.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even myself in the industry, I would be considered somewhat a pariah, even amongst my own colleagues, which is sad because I'm just trying to be as logical as I can and look to root cause. I can't explain the psychology of why people are happy with apathy, but it seems to be that it's at a very basic level. I think it is simply too confrontational for people. I think people want relative comfort. They don't want to feel like there's something wrong, right? And some of these concepts that we're describing, like chemicals in our food supply, these are silent. You can't taste them, you can't smell them. There is nothing more terrifying than that. And I think there are many that want to believe that everything is fine, that metabolic dysfunction, chronic inflammatory diseases are all par for the course, and it's just part of our genetics, which I think to me is just absolute apathy. And I refuse to partake in a system that does that. And unfortunately, the medical system has become that. I think it has gaslit people to believe that disease is an inevitability. It's just a part of life. Just your genes, just bad luck.
Yeah.
But I think to think like that actually takes away from how resilient we are as a species, how resilient this body is when fed well and moved well, as you can attest to with your message, right, Max? I think we have to get away from that lazy approach. I think it's time to take on some very difficult concepts to confront the fact that we're probably being poisoned.
Yeah, I mean, apathy is malignant. I mean, it's like these people are literally polishing plates on the deck of the Titanic.
Yeah.
Not seemingly completely oblivious to the fact that they're on the deck of the Titanic. Meaning, like, you look around and public health statistics are just dismal. So many people are sick and struggling, and it's gotta be due to something that we're being exposed to. Yeah. And the gut is our largest interface with the environment. So I mean, like, how could it be anything but something or things, that we're ingesting?
Yeah, absolutely. And a good way to look at it. Okay, if we look at the last 30 years, say, or 2 decades, I think obesity is up 300%. Diabetes is up 300% and rising. It might be more here in the States. A lot of these inflammatory diseases, autoimmune illnesses, are going up by 9 to 10% every year.
Wow.
Comparatively, I think Crohn's disease in the last 50 years is up by about 500%. I mean, these are huge increases, right? One of the most pervasive, problematic agrochemicals that is used in our food supply, actually the most common, is something we call glyphosate, also known as Roundup, produced by, actually, ironically, a drug company, Bayer, who bought Monsanto many years ago. This is now quite prominent in our food and water supply. It is so prominent, Max, that there was a study done, I think in South America somewhere, could have been Argentina, where glyphosate was detected in 50% of the rain samples.
Wow.
Now, this is circulating within our ecosystem. So we've got a real problem on our hands. And glyphosate is marketed as a safe agrochemical to use because humans lack a pathway, or human cells lack a pathway called the Shikimate pathway, which glyphosate blocks. And that's true, it doesn't affect humans per se. But remember what I said earlier, that we are more microbiome than we are human beings. And glyphosate affects about 60% of our gut microbiome. So it is affecting susceptible bacteria. It is probably resulting in a decline of these bacteria. And in their absence, you get overgrowth of other bacteria that probably shouldn't be overgrowing. These are the more harmful gram negatives, and that sets off that inflammatory response within the gut. And I think glyphosate has a huge role to play in this modern epidemic of inflammatory diseases. Sadly, it is quite commonly used in our wheat supply, in our soy supply, almonds. Wow. And when you consider a country like America, even Australia, where I'm from, a huge proportion of our food comes from commercially grown grain. Probably 70%, if I was to hazard a guess, right? I mean, you'd probably know better than me, but 75% of our calories probably come from grain. We're not talking organic, well-grown, biodynamically grown grain. We're talking commercially farmed grain, and that sadly has to contain traces of this very commonly used agrochemical.
Yeah, they use it to dry out wheat, oats, things like that.
Yeah. It's a process called desiccation. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea that this compound is being sold by a company that's also selling you the drugs on the other end. I mean, it's like they're getting you from both ends.
Yeah.
And the fact that people will spend their whole lives just with blind trust, like swallowing this stuff down, and not questioning the possibility that maybe it's not in our best interests that all of our food is laced with this stuff, is just, to me, it's bewildering, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that speaks to a void, right? Like if you've got a society which has a huge proportion of the population trapped with some form of intellectual or spiritual void, and you then throw them a mode of living which is just consumption, based on consumption, whether it's consumption of social media content, TV or food or drink, for that matter, gambling. I mean, all these compulsions stem from a void as far as I'm concerned. You also then blind them to the real nature of reality. I've spoken before on something called Plato's allegory of the cave. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
I've read it in college. I read about it.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's a cave where humanity's kind of chained and shackled, and you've got captors of humanity. You've got a flame behind all these humans, and they project all these images onto a cave wall, which is what these puppeteers of society want you to see, and you're there. You're chained forever, and should one of these humans that are shackled break free and escape to the surface and to see the true nature of reality, their first compulsion is to say, hey, well, we've got to go down and tell our friends this. And they go down and describe it to these people that were born into bondage, and they do not take that message very well. And that was Plato's allegory, which is that reality is dictated by the engineers of society, and the vast majority of people that are in bondage to that don't want to know. And should the man push hard enough to inform his own cave mates that are trapped, they would kill him. And that's a great analogy for what occurs in this modern world when you've got these individuals saying, hey guys, something isn't right. You've got the vast majority saying, no, that's fine. And you've got trusted professionals, within those industries like dietetics and nutrition and medicine saying, yeah, everything's fine. Keep going the way we're going. But when you've gotten to a stage where to control metabolic dysfunction that you need to introduce drugs like Ozempic, I don't know if you guys use it here, but it's a very prominent drug.
It's huge here.
Which is a GLP-1 inhibitor. These sort of drugs are just hugely used. But the reality of the situation is it cannot be the solution for what is an environmentally derived issue.
They're trying to give it to kids now.
It's crazy. GLP-1, which is what the derivative of the drug is, it's increased in secretion when you eat right. Okay, when you've got nutrient sensing within the gut, when you're delivering quality amino acids, when you've got an integral gut barrier not broken down by agrochemicals, additives, and preservatives, you can fashion satiety through natural means. And I do not believe taking this drug exogenously is the way to do it. If we can improve our endogenous environment, our body's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
So you can boost GLP-1, which is the hormone that's essentially mimicked by these GLP-1 agonists, right? Like Ozempic, semaglutide. You can boost GLP-1 naturally with food.
Absolutely. And protein is an important macronutrient that moves the lever, right? And protein can be found in various matrices. You can find it in soy, you can find it in beans, you can find it in animal source foods. Animal source foods are extremely powerful, right? Extremely powerful because they contain all the essential amino acids, which the gut senses and provides you with satiation when it does sense that. In addition, the matrix in which they're found, it's just much easier for our gut to access the amino acids. It's not as much to break down. Not saying soy and bean and lentils can't be good sources of protein. They are. But remember what we've talked about farming, which is that how are these foods being farmed? How are they being farmed? Do they contain trace amounts of pesticide and herbicide, which then can adversely affect our gut microbiome? In addition, with these animal source foods, there appears to be this reduction in pesticide loads when consuming animal-based foods, because the animals themselves appear to be filters against these pesticides and herbicides. So glyphosate, for example, we do not believe it accumulates in muscle tissue. So if you're consuming the muscle of another animal, the glyphosate load in that's going to be very, very low. The animal's microbiome might be affected and that might adversely impact its health, but shouldn't really affect the actual load of pesticide in that food consumed. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And like when you eat meat, typically that is muscle, right? Like if you eat a piece of steak, that's the skeletal muscle of the animal from whence it came, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the primary way in which we consume meat, right? Organ meats, for whatever reason, have fallen out of fashion, probably to do with, the taste and the smell and so forth. They're all very nutrient-dense foods, of course, and can be part of a healthy diet. But the animals themselves, we've got to be thankful to these animals because they are filters against this toxic load in the environment.
Should there be any concern about consuming organ meats like liver? Some people have this belief that the liver stores toxins. Yeah. Is there any merit to that?
Yeah, there's probably some element of truth to that. I think animals raised very well, on pastures unlikely to accumulate that, but animals raised in feedlots, which seems to be the primary way of farming in most developed worlds, probably end up getting a significant load of heavy metals and antibiotics and huge amount of these sort of toxic loads. So I think the animal's health definitely is compromised. I'm not saying feedlot meat can't be healthy, but certainly pasture-raised, pasture-finished meat is a level above feedlot-fed animals. And the antibiotic exposure is significantly lower. I read a amazing statistic that 80% of the antibiotics produced here in America go towards animals, not towards humans.
Wow.
It's a staggering statistic. And these animals seem to be getting sick within these feedlot systems because that is simply not their natural environment. We farm cows in Australia. I've got a farm, and these animals are free-ranging. They move from one paddock to the next, and the antibiotic requirement for these animals is really low. Whereas confine them in a feedlot and give them pesticide-drenched grain all day, yes, you'll get a beautifully marbled piece of meat, but what's that doing to the health of the animal, the health of the microbiome, and in fact, the nutrient profile of the meat itself? I think there's quite ample evidence that the fatty acid profile on a grass-fed finished piece of steak is a lot better than something that's been raised in a feedlot, probably more nutrient-rich as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's you're a man after my own heart, because I love a good piece of grass-fed, whether ribeye or filet. A lot of a lot of medical experts that have gone through the orthodox medical system, particularly gastroenterologists, I feel like these days, they all seem to have become fiber-pilled in the sense that they make GI health all about fiber, as if fiber is this sort of like silver bullet, magical nutrient. Where does fiber, place with regard to your perspective on gut health?
Brilliant question, Max. And you're right. My industry is very much obsessed with the concept of fiber, but there are many nuances in this, and I'll give you some facts which I think will blow your mind and hopefully of your audience as well. The amount of energy limit that we can extract out of fiber for a human that has a very healthy gut microbiome that can actually use the fiber is about 10%. Whereas a horse, for instance, can extract 50% of its daily energy needs from fiber.
Wow.
Orangutans, chimpanzees, a huge proportion from fiber. To actually make fiber into something usable for us, you need a healthy microbiome, because a fiber is a non-digestible, it's not a nutrient per se. It's a nutrient for the gut microbiome, not for us. We have no mechanism to break down fiber. And when we talk about fiber, we have to separate between insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. Soluble fiber turns into this a very thick material in our right colon, which can be fermented by the gut microbiome. Insoluble fiber, found in foods like kale and so forth, it draws fluid into the gut. It's great to get the gut to move a little bit, but people with poor microbiomes tolerate insoluble fiber very poorly. And people with unwell, imbalanced gut microbiomes tend not to do well with soluble fiber either. And the reason for that goes back to the gut microbiome. Say we've got a functional, healthy gut microbiome. Take a Hasda tribesman, for instance, who's living in an environment best suited to a human. These people have very diverse microbiome, and they can deal with the soluble fiber beautifully. But what the gut microbiome does, it takes that fiber and converts it into something called butyrate, acetate, propionate. They're various short-chain fatty acids. So think of that for a minute. We are taking fiber, utilizing our microbiome to convert that into a fat. So the body's elegant. It is after fat, and you can use fiber to convert it into a ketone, which is a very powerful molecule in terms of anti-inflammatory effects and fuel. But there is a physiological limit. You simply cannot survive on a fiber-rich diet to meet your energy requirements. There is a physiological limit, which is about 10% for human beings, right? The 90% of the calories need to come from somewhere else. And the question is, where are they coming from? So this obsession that gastroenterologists have with fiber is somewhat misplaced, because I don't think they understand the nuance of that. And I don't think they're making the link between having to have a healthy gut microbiome to be able to deal with the fiber itself. I think fiber is great. I think soluble fiber is a brilliant substrate, prebiotic substrate for our gut microbiome. But first we need to fix the underlying issue, which is a compromised gut microbiome, which is probably, as we said, brought on by these various additives, preservatives, emulsifiers, and pesticides in our food supply.
Yeah, but they literally make it all about fiber.
Yeah.
And they make it about fiber at the expense of animal source products. Yeah. Like, it's the same way that, these plant-based alternative meat products and fake milks and whatever, it's not good enough for them to promote their products. They promote them. For something to be good, something else has to be bad, right? So they promote them at the expense of dairy. They'll say dairy's bad, drink our plant-based, ultra-processed milk instead. They'll say meat is bad, eat our fake eggs and our fake meat instead. And I feel like a lot of these, these more plant-based gastroenterologists and other medical experts, they make it all about fiber, but that's not enough. They also say that, eating foods like red meat, bad for the gut.
One of the things with a society that is in a process of decay, and I'm not suggesting we are in a process of decay, but I am in a way, is that they swing wildly from one pole to the next, right? And we're seeing it now play out so elegantly in nutrition. It's either all meat or no meat, all plants or no plants, and you can't sit somewhere in the middle. In fact, one of the things that drew me to your body of work was you were there saying, hey guys, I don't think the poles are the answer. It's somewhere in the middle. But not only that, there are many levels of nuance to this, and that's what I liked about yourself, and that's the answer. It really is. We are a extremely adaptable species, and there is no requirement for us to be at either extreme. The problem with a lot of the plant-based advocates, as I see it, is they're pushing for diets extremely low in quality protein. They're also pushing for these diets in the face of a declining gut microbiome, which is where a lot of plant-based foods are broken down. So that requires some forethought before they suggest it. In addition, their method of eating that they're calling for seems to be calling for more ultra-processed food, which is fundamentally the source of the issue. I mean, why would you eat fake eggs when you look at the list of ingredients? And as a farmer myself, when I step back and think of the production process that has to go towards creating a fake egg or a fake meat, it honestly it fills me with sadness. Yeah. Because I know the chemical inputs, I know the damage to the system that we've got to put up with to generate that bit of fake meat. It's not a pretty process, Max. And as people have become more separated from rural communities, there's this urban-rural divide. People are so disconnected with the process of actually generating food. They've got no idea where food comes from. You just turn up to a shop and you buy it, and that's it. Whereas if people were connected to where their food was coming from, they actually saw the process of food production, you wouldn't get that type of argument. You simply wouldn't get it. And I think animal ethics is brought into, and I agree, a lot of these feedlot conditions for cattle is horrific.
Absolutely.
And I disagree with them completely. The cattle that we own are free-ranging cattle and happy cattle, and yes, they're consumed for meat, but they're raised well, right? Whereas if the people calling for this plant-based way of eating knew the conditions that it took to generate their food and the animals that died, right, with all the pesticide exposure and tilling and whatnot, the snakes, the rats, the field mouse, the birds, the fish, where a lot of these pesticides leach into these waterways, they would be horrified. And so I'd love for people to get more connected to the actual production of their food supply, because I think it would change many minds.
It's super important. Yeah, a lot of the plant-based advocates, they seem oblivious to context. You know, they're promoting these extreme diets in the context of an environment where 73% of our food products are ultra-processed. And we have data from, maybe not in the US, but there was a study, I think, published out of France that found that the more closely people adhered to these meat-avoidant diets, the more likely they were to indulge in ultra-processed foods by about 20%. Like the vegans ate 20% more ultra-processed foods than omnivores. And the fact that it's true, a lot of these plant-based advocates might be aware of the value of dietary protein and may go to great lengths in their own lives to take protein powders and the like. But your average person who just on social media catches wind of this so-called better for, quote unquote, better for you plant-based diet, goes on and adopts it. And in the real world, we see that people who are on plant-based diets, they eat less protein. They also have less muscle mass. Their bone health isn't as great. Mental health isn't. So it's like, it seems to me incredibly irresponsible. And yet, nonetheless, it continues to be pushed again and again and again and again.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't need to be wholly plant-based, but if you take a zoomed out perspective, we are plant-based. As a civilization, we have become extremely grain 100%. And plant-based, and that's where the majority of our calories come from. Take America, since we're in America at the moment. Let's take America as an example. I think there is data to suggest that 15% of America's calories come from protein. Just 15%, the building blocks of life. And that makes up 15% of the diet, both from a combination of animal-sourced foods and plant-sourced foods, right? So the question is, where is the other 85% coming from? And when you take the protein leverage hypothesis, which was a beautiful, elegant hypothesis that I absolutely loved, which is that if you do not provide adequate protein to an animal, take any animal, and I'll use humans as an animal, this creature would be forced to employ a grazing method of eating to hit that protein target. And so we're driven by this perpetual hunger through these low protein diets, which unfortunately we've replaced with refined fats and refined carbohydrates, which, as we both know, are a fuel source in a sedentary environment. What a terrible combination, right? And so you've got this steady decline of muscle and bone mass, right? Of lean mass loss and accumulation of adipose tissue, entry into this chronic inflammatory state, which is paradoxical because as you enter that inflammatory state, your protein requirement keeps climbing, yet we've got this 10 to 15% protein intake through the rest of the person's life. So they just chronically lose muscle and bone, become less able to move, and it's a vicious cycle.
Wait, so chronic inflammation actually increases your need for protein? Why? Yeah. Because you're in just a catabolic state?
Correct. Absolutely spot on. And this is well known in say, intensive care environments or in burns victims and people that are unwell. They supplement their protein either into a vein, which is TPN, or nasogastric feeding, because we know that the protein requirements are higher in a sick population.
Wow.
Right? And so, again, to use some of America's statistics, I think, some studies done a while ago, I think almost a decade ago, showed about 88% of the American population was metabolically unwell, adult population, notwithstanding children, but and that's starting to be seen more and more in children too, right? We're starting to see huge rates of metabolic dysfunction. So if 88% of the population is metabolically unwell, and you measure that through things like insulin resistance, your lipids, things like HDL, blood pressure, which is a sign of vascular dysfunction if you've got high blood pressure, and visceral obesity, those are the metrics used. If you've got a population immersed in an inflammatory environment, their protein requirements are higher. Yet we're consuming 10 to 15% of our calorie needs from, we're getting that in protein, which is just far too low. So we're just left in this catabolic state where muscle and bone breaks down. And that's interesting because as your musculoskeletal system degrades, your compulsion to move drops even further, right? So one of the things I tell my own clients is, work towards improving your intake of the building blocks, amino acids, vitamins, nutrients, minerals, all these sort of things, and watch your body composition change. And then your need or your compulsion for exercise will come into play. But we've got a fixed diet first. So there's rhetoric that my industry's had, which is just you need to diet and exercise, right? And count your calories. I just think it's terrible because a lot of these people simply are not in a state to exercise. Whereas you and I know that when you're physiologically in functioning or firing on all cylinders, you want to move, you want to get out there and do things. That's our birthright to be able to move, but we're not in a position to do so.
Wow. And there's just dreadfully little nuance in that statement, eat less. Because, your average person, they hear that, and then with all the plant-based messaging that we discussed earlier, maybe they're going to eat less meat. Maybe they're going to eat less steak, less chicken breast, and more of the ultra-processed stuff. I also think a really important nuance to tease out in what you just said is, if you're not eating protein, you're eating energy. I'm sure you're familiar with Ted Naiman, he's been on our show. He's kind of been really, I think, helpful in terms of helping illustrate the difference between protein calories and energy calories. And under that in that energy bucket, you have carbs and fat. It's not that carbs are any worse for you or better for you than fat. It's just that carbs and fat are both energy. So if you're not eating protein, you're eating energy. And this widespread metabolic dysfunction can be boiled down, I think, in many ways to energy toxicity. We're just like, we're over consuming food, and we're more sedentary than we've ever been in human history.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoy Ted's work, and I think his concept of energy toxicity is absolutely spot on. And as we spiral into this energy toxic state, the mitochondrial dysfunction that kicks in, the mitochondria, these little energy producing factory plants within our cells, they become extremely dysfunctional, and they spew out this horrible reactive oxidative species, and it's this vicious cycle of inflammation, not just at a gut level but at an intracellular level, all driven by a food supply. I think Ted's made the point, along with others, that the magic point for protein might be around that 27%, where your caloric requirements actually drop off quite significantly because of the satiating effect of protein. And I think that's about spot on. I think we teach our patients to ensure that they're getting protein with every meal. Quality protein in particular can be plant or animal-based. Animal-based, I believe, is superior. And when that occurs, your caloric intake for the day drops off as your protein levels rise. I mean, there's probably a ceiling for protein. I'm not sure where that is. I mean, some people consume about 60% of their caloric needs from protein. But beyond that, I suspect protein can become detrimental because you malabsorb a lot of that protein, and it can end up in your colon. And whilst in your colon, it can set up this form of digestion, which is putrefactive digestion, where the gut microbiome breaks down protein and they liberate a lot of putrefactive metabolites, which probably leads to an increase in your gram negatives, which then leads to increased lipopolysaccharides being generated by your gut microbiome, which then compromises the gut barrier. So it's about finding the balance. I agree with a lot of your work, and but also kind of having that personalized nutrition as well. I mean, how sick is the person? How inflammatory are their states? And how do we tease out what exactly do they need? So this is where good quality dietitians come into. And one of the most important things that I did with my practice was affiliate myself with a group of excellent dietitians that allowed me to practice in that way. I think nutrition was something that I broadly understood, but to apply that on a personalised scale requires a good quality dietitian and nutritionist to be able to implement it. But sadly, the vast majority of them, again, are captured by industry, just like the medical world, where they espouse this food pyramid as kind of as the holy grail. But we know that's certainly not the case.
Yeah, I mean, the world of dietetics, I mean, dietitians are not a monolith. Like, there are many wonderful, amazing dietitians out there. But for example, we know that, one of the most influential professional organizations that kind of oversees that profession is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And we recently found out that they were not just taking gifts from the ultra-processed food industry, but they have stock in many of those companies. We saw that the American Beverage Association was recently paying dietitians on social media to promote aspartame, which I don't know what your stance is on aspartame. I think that the jury's probably still out. It's probably safe in small doses, but that was not clearly disclosed, and they got in trouble for that. The FTC actually fined those dietitians for not properly disclosing that they were taking money from the soda lobby. And so it has in many ways become a captured industry. And it's really unfortunate, because there are some really fantastic dietitians out there. Many of them follow me, which is
absolutely
great.
Absolutely. And your message is a really important message. So keep doing what you're doing. And actually, I've thought about it, and people ask me, what is at the heart of the issue? And just to speak to some of that corruption, the heart of the issue is a broken monetary system. When you've got a system of money that is built on debt and something we call fractional lending, where there's no true value to the money that underlies us, you get something called the rise of power, and corporations are an offshoot of that type of money system. And as you get this growing body of influence as a corporation, in economic theory, it's known as game theory, or tragedy of commons, where you get this unrelenting pursuit of profit. right, to satisfy shareholders and so forth. And that unrelenting pursuit of profit is done so at the well-being of people. So that pursuit of profit has to harm people, and that is the tragedy of commons. And as that power grows, it influences these various bodies, whether it's the Medical Association or the Dietetics Association. The American Heart Association was deeply involved in promoting vegetable oils and refined transaturated fats to the population, and it was done at the expense of saturated fat, which in itself is a unrefined whole food found in animal-based foods. And so we need the population to be aware of these concepts. This is what I talk about. It's about awareness, but a lot of people are too deeply trapped in this consumption model, and they forget that we're actually creators. We're creators, not consumers. And when you create, you're aware of what's going on. So it's really important work that you're doing in terms of raising awareness. And I think people are ready to listen. I think people are starting to wake up to this idea that maybe disease is not our default state. Maybe the solution for obesity isn't cutting out part of your stomach or taking a substance that your body naturally creates. But for that, I think we need to hit rock bottom as a society, and I think we're nearing that point. I believe
we're coming out of the cave. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. At Plato's allegory, it's just few of us gone down, few of us have been taken out, but there's a lot of us saying, hey, we need to emerge to see the nature of reality, to see that there are some dark forces that fundamentally engineer and puppeteer society, right? Which the monetary system selects for. I think people are starting to be ready to have that conversation. It's an exciting time, I believe, for us.
Yeah, I think so as well. What about because again, you're an expert in all things human GI tract. What about the connection between, because this comes up again and again, the connection between red meat and colon cancer, which is sort of like the type of cancer I think that people most closely associate with red meat consumption?
Yeah, great question. I think there has been a natural bias against red meat for quite some time. Some of it ideological and starting off from various religious groups like the Seventh-day Adventists, and that's interesting, but this whole red meat and bowel cancer, I think it was about 2014, 22 members of the World Health Organization sat down to look at all the data concerning red meat and bowel cancer. Prior to that, there was no consensus opinion, right? They looked at about 800 papers that had studied red meat and cancer, and I think 780 of them showed no link, or wow. There just simply wasn't a link. They got rid of those and focused on the 20 papers that showed a link. A lot of those studies were not randomized control trials. They're observational studies, very poor qualities of evidence based on food frequency questionnaires, FFQs, which we know are terrible for nutritional studies. Of those 20 studies that they analysed, the 22-member panel, I think 14 of them had spent most of their careers trying to prove that red meat was terrible for health.
Wow.
Right? And of that 22-member panel, they came to the conclusion, against some resistance, but vast majority agreed on it, that there was a 1.18% increase, a 18% increase, which is a relative risk of 1.18, in people consuming more than 50 grams of processed meat per day of colorectal cancer. Now, think of the individual that consumes 50 grams of processed red meat every day, right? And this is probably an individual eating burgers, chips, fries, with milkshakes, pizzas. That's the sort of individual you've got. And they looked at that group and said, well, it increases colorectal cancer by 18%. Hence, processed red meat is probably affiliated or associated with colorectal cancer. But what really is interesting is they lumped in unprocessed red meat into that decision. The data was looked at for processed red meat, and they came out, that spat out a number, but they lumped in unprocessed red meat into that whole process as well, an 18% increase. And that was then used by global bodies like the World Health Organization, which is which influences government policies, and a lot of health bodies in various countries look up to that group. And even in Australia, we've got institutions like the Bowel Cancer Australia promoting that, which is that red meat causes bowel cancer. But just to give you some context and your listeners context, smoking is associated with lung cancer. We've known about this for decades. The relative risk when you smoke and lung cancer is something like 3,000%. 3,000. I mean, that's what real risk looks like.
That's a massive leap.
Yeah, massive leap. And so we've got to be careful in looking at relative risk. Okay, relative risk can be utilized to really blow out of proportion the increase in risk. So 1.18 is very different to a 30-fold increase in lung cancer.
Right. That's not even a 20% increase in relative risk.
Correct. And the population studied, the methods used to study them, like the food frequency questionnaires, were hugely problematic, right? There have been some really big studies, like the polyp study published in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Women's Health Initiative, which were all very, very good quality prospective data capture, which showed no link between colorectal cancer and red meat consumption, in particular unprocessed red meat consumption, yet those studies were ignored, interestingly. So it's sort of like they cherry-picked the data to confirm a bias that they had already. And one has to wonder about the conflicts of interest in these sort of industries, because the more you demonize unprocessed red meat, quality red meat, the more you can promote the ultra-processed rubbish that has to fall into that void. As people seek to be satiated, to satisfy their hunger. If you continually engineer this idea that red meat is problematic for them, well, they go for the lower quality food. Look, no bias against chicken. I think chicken can be a great source of protein. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy chicken, but poultry consumption has gone up significantly in the last 2 decades as opposed to beef consumption. The methods used to grow poultry is much more problematic than beef. So again, you're ending up with a lower quality source of protein. You can get well-raised poultry, but I do believe it's an inferior source compared to red meat. And
red meat's way more nutrient dense, is it not?
Absolutely. And the iron content. I mean, the World Health Organization states quite clearly that iron deficiency is a pandemic of epic proportions, but in the same vein it says, well, red meat's terrible for you. Don't eat it from bowel cancer. So it's this gaslighting, right? And that's coming into play. And in that void of an iron deficiency, which we're using as an example, you get the rise of all these synthetic iron formulations, which you can directly inject into your vein or take as a tablet. But this is not the real thing. The red meat, not only does it come with iron, it's rich in zinc, selenium, choline, and all these other factors, B12. There's just so much more that goes along with eating foods in their whole matrix. The solution is not individually replacing the vitamins that we're lacking. I think that's a problematic method of educating the population.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but like when you go to have any type of GI procedure, I've never had one, but from my sort of like lay vantage point, you're typically put on what's I think referred to, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a low residue diet, foods that are basically absorbed fully in the small intestine. And meat, animal products are among those foods, right? Like your body fully absorbs red meat, right? And so the mechanism by which red meat, like it likely doesn't, as far as I know, not how much of it is actually making its way down to the colon, to the large intestine.
Excellent question. Actually, very little. If you've got a healthy individual with a capable stomach, with the capacity to produce acid to help denature and break down the proteins. If you've got healthy breakdown of the protein in your small bowel, most of that is gone. Theoretically, okay, take an individual. healthy young man, remove his colon, give him a bag, a stoma bag, an ileostomy, where you connect the small bowel to the external surface of the skin. If they've lost their colon, they can no longer produce feces the normal way. That individual consuming a diet rich in animal food would have very little output from the ileostomy, right?
Wow.
Most of the people with ileostomies figure out pretty quickly that a diet rich in plant food means that they have to change their bag quite regularly, okay? And so they figure out the way to eat, and most of their diets are very rich in animal-sourced foods. The caveat to that is, if you've got all this food making its way into the colon, you better have a damn healthy gut microbiome to be able to deal with it. It goes back to the original point that we've got a compromised gut microbiome, so less able to deal with it. And you're spot on with colonoscopy. We tell, not just myself, but every gastroenterologist in the world probably would give you a sheet of paper says, consume a low residue diet, eat poultry, eat meat, eat white rice, eat potatoes, eat sweet, less so sweet potatoes, but eat a diet like that, so not too much ends up in the colon, because the colon's a reservoir. It holds foods that you've consumed a week ago, right? 2 weeks ago, months ago for some people. And it's very evident to me when people haven't followed those instructions, because when we're doing the colonoscopy, we can see these fibers, leaves, and so forth in their natural
undigested plant material.
Undigested plant material. We simply don't digest it as efficiently. Plants are just not as efficiently broken down in our system. The plants that we're probably best adapted for are starches, things like sweet potatoes, pumpkin. Brilliant. These things break down very quickly because we've got the amylase to be able to cleave that. Most of the rest of the plant material generally makes its way down into the colon, where it's then a substrate for the microbiome to break down, which the microbiome takes, converts it into energy for itself, as well as some vitamins like B12 for itself. Then it gives us a partial bargain. It gives us about a small proportion of that as a fuel, which is butyrate, acetate, propionate. Our colon cells take that fuel and use that fuel. It's a partial bargain, a trade-off that this symbiotic mass of microbiome does with us, and we've done so for many, many millions of years. But the damage that we're creating in the modern world to lead to disease is not just at a microbiome level; it's at a food level, and the variety of foods that we're consuming to bring that on. It's really a layered picture. It's a complex thing. There's not one thing that's creating the damage. It's a multitude of factors.
Well, among the multitude, what would you say your top 3 high leverage, high impact tips are for getting back to a healthy gut microbiome?
Brilliant question. I would say prioritize protein as a macronutrient. I would say at least 30% of our diet or our daily caloric need needs to come from protein. More if possible, depending on your level of activity and state of disease and so forth. Remember, we said the more disease and chronic inflammation you have, your protein requirements might be higher. The second tip would be make sure that the protein is coming from high quality food matrices that not only contain the protein, but potentially contain B12, iron, various minerals, various vitamins, so you're getting more bang for your buck. So you're not having to consume a wide variety of foods, right, to get these nutrients. And the third thing is try and prioritize foods that have a low exposure to agrochemicals and additives. Really try and minimize the amount of chemical exposure that we're getting in our food supply. We're living in a chemical shitstorm, for lack of a better word, and the more we can weather that storm, the more that we look after our microbiome. And if I can throw in a fourth tip,
please.
I think prioritize foods like fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, dairy. Fermented dairy is a health food. High quality cheese is a health food, because these foods that we then feed our gut microbiome, these prebiotic foods, is a substrate for them to proliferate and grow in. So it's about being aware of what we're consuming. I don't think it is as simple as all meat or all plants. There's nuance to that statement.
Yeah, I mean, it's such important advice, and I would co-sign everything that you just said. I mean, we're totally aligned there. But I feel like we live in a world that, again, it's like there's just so many, just our ever-present proximity to these like ultra-processed, highly marketed foods. And then you throw on top of that the technology, right? That's like constantly pulling our attention away from what it is that we're doing in the current moment. So many of us, I feel like, find ourselves just eating mindlessly. We go to I do this too. I go to the fridge, I open up the door. Most of the time I'm not even hungry. I'm just bored. I want to put something in my face. And so how do we stop what is, I think, a really important pandemic of mindless eating? How can we eat more mindfully?
It's a great question, Max. I'm not sure I've got an answer, but I can certainly tell you what I do from a personal perspective. And you can never tell anyone else to kind of do this, but it's really worked well for me. Mindfulness, I think, stems from a belief that the body in itself may not be fundamental at all. I've often had the thought that our awareness, our consciousness is actually the most fundamental aspect of existence. And a lot of theoretical physicists and consciousness researchers are starting to say the same thing. Our consciousness is what creates our reality. I mean, we're delving into theoretical physics here, but once you're aware of the fact that your awareness actually has a divine origin, so to speak, I think you're compelled to look after your body. You're less willing to fall for the tricks that the puppeteers of society, the engineers of society want us to. And in a way, mindful eating is actually a swimming against the tide. You're literally swimming against the tide, whereas most people are carried by the tide. And I personally refuse to be carried by the tide. But you're right, it's a daily exercise in mindfulness, and it doesn't need to be prayer. It can be meditation, it can be exercise, it can be a walk in nature. All you're doing in those instances is really becoming more aware of your own consciousness. And I think that might be the way to do it long term. I personally do a little bit of fasting, not because of not because of anything else, not to control calories or anything, but just to remind myself that, hey, food is a gift, and in that period that I'm going to consume food, I'm going to make sure it's high quality. Okay, I'm not suggesting people fast, but I'm just saying that is just a personal method that I employ to increase my own awareness about food.
Yeah, bringing awareness to your food choices is so important. Was there like, can you identify in your life was there a time, maybe it was a patient, a specific turning point for you where these concepts started to really dawn on you as being important?
Absolutely. I can definitely give you that. It was a series of events, but I think my own personal health declining in my mid-30s despite following all the dietary guidelines, eating oats every day, heaps of vegetables, minimizing my intake of meat because I was kind of engineered through medical school to believe that. At the same time this was occurring to me, I was watching my father, who was a type 2 diabetic, progressively get worse with his insulin requirements. And, we come from a long line of diabetics. Something like 6 of his brothers had passed away from heart disease before the age of 65, right? They didn't survive past 65. So he was on this trajectory towards a declining health. Watching my practice in medicine, where I was becoming deeply cynical about my own practice, that what am I actually doing for these people? And at that point, there had to be an increasing awareness. So I fundamentally roused myself from my slump. And I was very lucky. There were some really good sources of people in medicine starting to question the narrative as well, right? I watched... remember watching some of Sean Baker's stuff, and I think you know Sean Baker well. And whilst I might not necessarily agree with everything he says, the fact that he was suggesting that, hey, meat can be part of a healthy diet, this was kind of eye-opening stuff. And
he's legit, and he is really helping to push the science forward. He's not just a social media personality.
100%. And you know, I've spoken with Sean a number of times. We've done a couple of podcasts together, and I agree with him that animal-sourced foods are a health food and should be appropriately leveraged. And so it was really a personal journey for me. And clinically, just having that feeling like I was able to achieve an outcome for some of my patients. Not everyone will follow down that pathway, but the people that are able to do it almost always end up with a better outcome, whether it's reversing their illness or at least gaining some relief from it. And for them, that's an eye-opening moment, right, where they've been able to see the surface of reality, and then they pursue it, and then they tell their family members and friends, and it has got this viral effect. So I think there was a number of factors that came together, but a huge amount of it was just I couldn't function in my field anymore. I couldn't just be someone who did procedures and pushed pills and wrote scripts. I refused to be a part of that tentacle of a corporate Medusa. I refused to be part of that medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex. Whilst I acknowledge that the medical industry has made huge leaps and we do some amazing things, the vast majority of our resources are being directed towards lifestyle illnesses that have a clear environmental origin and must be addressed through lifestyle and environment. The solution is not something else which benefits the pharmaceutical industry, right? So opting out of that triad was really important for me. When I say triad, I'm talking about big pharma, big medicine, and big agriculture, right? That is the triad. And that is the unholy trinity where disease stems from. The more people awaken to that, the better. And listen, it is a challenge to eat healthy, but I was here yesterday in America in San Diego, and there was an amazing organic grocer that I walked into. Brilliant food. It's all there. We just have to support these producers, the farmers that are doing this, the butchers that are producing good quality meat, the grocers, the supermarket industries that are doing this. I've also driven through and seen numerous amounts of burger joints and ultra-processed food environments. If we can support less of those and more of the good guys, I think you've got a population that's heading towards health. Perhaps I'm it's idyllic thinking, but I think it's important to dream of a better world.
Absolutely. Here in LA, we do have some burger joints that are pretty great. Grass-fed. You can find a grass-fed burger pretty easily.
Amazing. Here
in Los Angeles, but I totally agree, and I think that the increased demand. People will say it's more, maybe it's more expensive to eat healthy. It can be more expensive to eat more healthily, but I think with increased demand and continuing to vote with your dollars for the system that you want ultimately to manifest, that's the reason why you can now get organic food at Target and at Walmart and at in the freezer section at Costco, you can find wild salmon and grass-fed beef. It's because of demand created by brilliant people such as yourself who are advocating for this.
Yeah, I think so. I think the population will drive us towards a better world, because if we leave it up to these corporate entities, it's that tragedy of commons, pursuit of profit, harming people. But we appear to have a intersection here now where people are aware that there is something very wrong with the system. I think as a population, we are manifesting change. And whether we can wrestle back that power from the entities that kind of control the food supply will be a different matter. But all we can do is keep trying, because eventually they'll have to respond to where that demand is coming from. And if it's coming from the people, it's a great thing. I think we have to also kind of acknowledge the wealth disparity and how that affects health. The more socioeconomically disadvantaged a population is, the less healthy behaviours they're going to pursue as well. So I think it's always important to be mindful of the monetary system that kind of strips wealth away from people, and also vote and push for a better system of money as well, because I think that eventually will be the biggest lever to pull in terms of health. Is to understand what the system that we're existing in now is.
Yeah. What's next for you?
What's next for me, Max? I'm starting off as a farmer in the cattle industry. I've probably chosen to leap into farming at the worst possible time for farming. Government policy and global policy seems to be directing its wrath towards farmers. Apparently, we're the biggest contributors to global emissions, if you believe that.
Do you come from a farming family?
I don't, Max.
You just decided you wanted to become a farmer.
I decided that if I'm going to talk about farming, I'm going to have to understand it. So I purchased quite a large cattle farm in the northern part of New South Wales, God's country, as the Australian locals call it. And, I'm working with farmers to understand what farming is. I mean, I'm not there on the farm 24/7. We've got a smaller farm that I live on in Sydney where we've got chickens and a few other little animals there, but mainly just pets. But the bigger farm's all about understanding what rotational grazing is. So I'm going to understand what regenerative agriculture is. Regenerative agriculture, I think, has the capacity to reduce the chemical load in our agricultural systems. It's sort of leveraging technology that we had thousands of years ago and we lost 50 to 60 years ago as this agrochemical method of farming became popular. So it's a journey for me. I think life's about learning and really pushing your soul to its limits, right? And that's the journey that I'm on. I mean, people say, why invest money into something that won't return dollars? But that's not the goal for me. I think really flourishing in my field as a doctor that understands root cause of disease would be my ultimate goal. So I'm not a great farmer, Max. Trust me, I was less than handy on the farm, but and the farmers laugh at me all the time. But I'm certainly going to try and give it my best shot.
So cool. Well, dude, this was super fun. I'm so grateful that you came out, and great getting to chat with you. And I think you're a brilliant guy. So, I implore all my listeners to check you out, follow you on social media. I've got one last question for you, but before we get to that, where do you hang out on social media? I know you're on Twitter, Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, I just push my thought out on those mediums, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. My handles,
or X now.
Yeah, X. Yeah, my handle's just my name, Dr. Pran Yoganathan. A lot of my stuff is not necessarily always health related. I tend to delve a lot into consciousness and awareness and whether the brain is involved with creating all of that. I think that's a huge area of interest for me, and I will continue to pursue that because, as I said before, increasing consciousness is the only way we can kind of get out of this mess. Increasing awareness, so that's something that I'll choose to pursue.
I love it, man. I love it. So important. So important. And yeah, you're just a light in the field. So thank you for doing what you do. Last question that I guess I ask everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
Living a genius life, I believe, in each and every one of us is an absolute divine spark that allows us to create. We're all creators. We're co-creators in this reality. So we are co-creating with a creator of some form. And I think we have to tap into that creative aspect of us. I think the modern world that we've built is all about consumption, right? We consume things that others are creating, and increasingly so corporate entities are creating. So it's about wrestling that back and choosing to create, whether that's a little vegetable patch in your backyard that you're growing organically for your friends or family, or there's a few chickens that can produce good quality eggs for you. It is all about that. I think we have to create our reality and wrestle back control from the social engineers of our era. And trust me, they exist. You may choose not to believe that they don't, but they do.
Yeah, they do. Man, well, happy to have a warrior such as yourself, boots on the ground, fighting for us. It's amazing. It's amazing stuff. So thanks again for coming out. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.